1 Corinthians chapter 7. If you'll follow along with me, beginning in verse 1, let's notice what the Bible says. Now, concerning the matters about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. But because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer, but then come together again so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Let's pause to pray. Father, as we come to your word, we're coming from all different situations, Lord. Some single, some married, some single again, some who have thriving intimacy in their marriages, some who are in situations of brokenness. Lord, whatever people are bringing here this morning, God, I pray that your Spirit, by the power of your gospel, would transform how we view sex, and that we might live lives in our sexual arena in ways that are pleasing to you. And we ask these things in Christ's name. Amen. Well, some of you know that I was on vacation last week. I had a chance to take my wife, Cami, down to Mexico to enjoy some rest and relaxation, to do a little sermon research for this sermon's topic this week. And when we got back from that trip, her mom was taking care of our kids while we were there at the beach. And when we got back, she said, "Hey, Phillip, when you get a chance, you're going to need to talk with Nathan and Lawson about a question they asked me when I put them to bed the other night." And so I brought them in one at a time. And when I was talking to Lawson, our 6-year-old who's in first grade, I said, "Hey, did you have a funny conversation with Miss Steed last week while we were gone?" And he starts giggling and he says, "Yes." And he says, "Well, do you want to ask me what you asked her?" And so he looks at me in the eye and he says, "Do you ever have sex with Mom?" This is a 6-year-old. I said, "What do you mean, do I ever have sex with Mom?" And so he asked me the question again. I said, "Well, before I tell you that, how did you hear about that word sex?" Well, there's a particularly troublesome kid that's on his bus who knows all sorts of things that a first grader shouldn't know. And he was pontificating and explaining and teaching about this topic in the bus line, waiting to come home one day for first grade. So I said to Lawson, "Well, what did he tell you about what sex is?" He said, "Well, here's what you do. You get together with another person, and you go somewhere by yourself, and then you turn all the lights off, and then you start kissing each other," and then he starts giggling, "and then you rub your bottoms together." And I said, no, Lawson, that's not what sex is. That's not the picture at all. But I'm sitting there stunned by this conversation. I knew at one point with 4 boys, I'd be doing the birds and the bees talks plenty of times, but I assumed maybe they'd come at 10, 11, 12, somewhere in that range, not at 6 years old. And what it reminded me of is that the culture is not waiting to talk to our children about sex. And the culture is not waiting to confront each one of us about our sexuality. And that's precisely why we need to think through what the gospel means for shaping our sexuality. So we come to this text. It follows right on the heels of the one that Andrew preached last week at the end of 1 Corinthians 6. And Paul is talking through and fleshing out what it looks like in marital intimacy to glorify God in your body. And I wonder if you're anything like me, that you've noticed that in the church, we don't often talk about sex. You probably haven't heard a lot of sermons about sexuality. That's not an easy conversation for some of us to have. It's an awkward thing at times to bring up, especially awkward for me this morning considering my parents are sitting in the audience while I'm teaching about sex. Okay, and so what I want us to do this morning is to help us think through 3 big ideas about the way the gospel reshapes our understanding of sexuality. We're going to see the first one beginning in verses 1 and 2. We see the way that Paul talks about how sex is a priority. Notice what he says, sex is a priority. Now, concerning the matters about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. But because of temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. And so Paul is writing here in these first verses, showing them why sex should be seen as a priority for Christians. Now, we think about the picture of sexuality in the Bible. From the very beginning, God designs Adam and Eve that the two might become one flesh. The sexual union between man and woman is built into the DNA of what God intends for marriage. And yet, after the fall, we see brokenness comes into the world. Sin ruptures everything, including sexuality. So what is intended for pleasure now often brings pain. And what is intended to unite two people together often can be dividing. And we live in a culture that shows that brokenness when it comes to sexuality. Because at the same time in our culture, sex means everything and sex means nothing. Sex is all that your life revolves around, and yet sex is no big deal. But right here with Paul, he shows us a different way. He shows us that for Christians, we should see sex as a priority. And he gives us 5 reasons why sex is a priority for Christians. You'll notice the first one there in verse 1. Sex is a priority because of questions that arise in our community of believers. So he says there, concerning the matters about which you wrote. So in other words, the Corinthians had written to him, and they had said to him this phrase that he puts in quotes there, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. They are asking questions about sexuality. It's on the minds of the people. And Paul knows that they need answers. They need gospel direction to these questions. You know, some of you, before you got married, maybe you went through premarital counseling. And they talked to you about issues related to sexuality. Maybe some of you, when you were growing up, had a birds and the bees conversation with your parents. Or you learned about sex through that awkward 5th grade class with the really weird teacher that talked about all the different ways your anatomy functions. And whatever situation you find yourself in, every one of us is asking questions about this issue. That's exactly why for you as parents, the birds and the bees can't be a one-time conversation. You can't just say, got that checked off my list and never have to address that again. No. Sex is a priority because questions are constantly arising in the community. Instead, for you that are parents, you should think about the birds and the bees in the same way that you might train a child to use a gun. And so what do we do when we're doing gun safety training? We introduce the child to the gun. We show them how it works. What you're trying to do is teach them safety, to remove the mystery of how a gun works, the appeal of it, help them to understand how it is to properly function. And that's not something you can just show an 8-year-old one time. All right, here's your 410. Here's how it works. Now take it and use it whenever you want to. No, that would be malpractice as a parent if you were to do that with something as dangerous as a gun. And yet often that's the way we treat sex. We might not even talk to our kids about it, or we do it just minimally. We refuse to engage. But Paul says it needs to be a priority for the Christian because of these questions that come up in the community. But notice the second idea here. Paul says that sex is a priority because it's celebrated in the culture. So a few years ago, I had the opportunity to travel to Greece. And one of the towns that we visited was this city of Corinth that Paul is writing this letter to the church that is there. And last week, we talked about the way that in Corinth, one of the common practices there was temple prostitution. That you would worship the gods and goddesses of that land through sexual activity with temple prostitutes. And as we toured Corinth and we saw the remnants of that city, you could see up on the mountaintop right next to the city was the ruins of the temples that were there. And what would happen, our guide told us, is that every day the temple prostitutes would make their way down the mountain from that hill and walk into the city center. And they would be dressed provocatively, and they would be wearing sandals, and they would walk through the sandy streets of that city and try to entice people to come back with them to worship the Greek gods through this act of prostitution. They were surrounding the culture that was there with the allure and enticement of sexuality. That's the context that Paul's writing in. And one of the things that stands out to me from that time when I was there in Corinth is this guide told us that these women would be walking in sandals. And on the bottom of those sandals were inscribed the Greek word that translated into English says, "Follow me." And so every step they took, the bottoms of their sandals would plant themselves in that sand and leave a trail, enticing the men of that city with every step. Follow me, follow me, follow me. And that's precisely how the culture is seeking to lead each one of us astray when it comes to sex. The culture is offering us a vision of sex and celebrating it in such a way that it's saying, follow me. Live in the way that you want to live. If it feels good, do it. Our cultural norms when it comes to sexuality are basically, as long as it's consensual and as long as it doesn't hurt anybody, anything goes. But the Bible gives us a different picture. And when we live in a culture that celebrates sexuality, we need to see sex as a priority if we're ever going to engage it well. And you know the way that the culture is celebrating sex right now because you're watching March Madness just like me. And it seems like every fourth commercial is about Viagra or some other sexually charged topic. It's right there in the mainstream of what we are encountering. And Paul says, if you're going to live in a culture that celebrates sex, you can't ignore it. You have to treat it like a priority. He goes on with the third idea in the book of Corinthians of why sex is a priority because of sin in the church. Paul has already written in 1 Corinthians 5 about sin that is not happening out in the culture, but is taking place right there in the church. In 1 Corinthians 5, he speaks of unbelievable sexual immorality, showing that there's not just confusion in the culture about sex, but also in the church. And when I was preparing for this sermon, I was reminded of some statistics that I saw about sexual sin in the church not long ago. And in this study that was done, it interviewed a variety of people. And when it segmented out those who are weekly church attenders at evangelical churches, do you know what the statistics found about sexual sin in the church? 57% of weekly attending evangelical churchgoers had premarital sex before they were married. 57%. And in this survey, 29% of the men that went to church every week in these evangelical churches had looked at pornography within the last week before this survey. We talk about sex as a priority, not just because it's a problem in the culture, but because it's a crisis right here in our church. And one of the reasons that men and women are in bondage to sexual sin in their lives is because we're too embarrassed to talk about it. We don't want to embrace the awkwardness and the vulnerability of confessing sin and coming alongside one another and seeking help. But the gospel calls us to a better way. Where that sin, whether it's sexual or otherwise, has been experienced, there can be deliverance in the gospel. You can be set free from whatever it is that you have done in the past. And so the push towards sexual purity is a priority for us because uprooting sin is a priority to God. He's going to do whatever it takes to make us more like Jesus, which means we need to see sex as a priority. But think about a fourth thing that we see back here in 1 Corinthians 7. Sex is a priority, according to verse 2, because of temptation from the devil. Do you see what Paul says there? He says, because of the temptation to sexual immorality. Paul is issuing a warning. You better care about sex. You better see sex as a priority because Satan does. Your spiritual enemies see this as a significant issue. They know that sexual desire creates an amazing opportunity to lead men and women astray from God's design for holiness. You see, some people might have the tendency to see sexual desire as evil, that it's inherently bad, but it's not. God is the one who granted us sexual desire. Sexual desire is not evil, but it is dangerous. It's like a wildfire. If it's not contained, it can spread further than you would ever think. It can do more damage faster than you would have ever believed. There is a danger to our sexual appetite, but what we must recognize when we see sex as a priority is the fact that we follow a king who took on flesh, who the Bible tells us in the book of Hebrews experienced temptation in every way that we do, yet without sin. So no matter what way Satan seeks to tempt you and to lead you astray from God's design for marriage, Jesus has been there and he has conquered that deception of the enemy. And we should see this as a priority because Jesus did as well. He walked a life of holiness and sexual purity and calls us to do the same. You see, Paul speaks here of the way that sex is a priority for a final and fifth reason here. He says, because sex is a pleasure to enjoy. Do you see what he says there in verse 2? See, the Corinthians were asking, should we just not marry? Should we just not have sexual relations? And instead, what does he say in verse 2? Each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. Several years ago when Cami and I were living in Louisville, she gave birth to our first son, Nathan, right at the start of an ice storm. It was one of the worst ice storms in the history of Louisville. It knocked out power across the city for a week. In fact, we couldn't even go from our home, or from the hospital back to our home because the power was out there. We had to live on air mattresses and folding chairs in an unfurnished apartment for about 2 days after we left the hospital. And I remember, though, about 9 or 10 months after that ice storm came along, there was headline news in the Louisville newspaper about a surge in babies being born in the city of Louisville. Because apparently when married people have nothing better to do, they have lots of sex. And when you have lots of sex, you have lots of babies. And so that took the place there in the midst of the power outages and other limitations that people had. And one of the things that we must recognize when we think through the way that sex is designed for our pleasure is that often we can shift our focus from seeing sex as a priority to instead either seeing sex as a problem to be managed or a preoccupation to be focused on. So there are some people that see sex as a problem to manage. So, yeah, I know I'm supposed to have sex. I don't really like it that much. My desire isn't there. And so I manage this process just like I pay my bills, like I do my taxes. I know it's something I'm supposed to do, but I don't really enjoy it all that much. That's the pull of some people. And on the other side of the equation, though, sex can be a preoccupation to be focused on. And so when some of you men heard me talk about sex as a priority, you're sitting next to your wife saying, yeah, you hear what he said? A priority. But in reality, what that's revealing is a pull towards preoccupation. Not that this is an important part of your life, but it is, in a sense, an all-consuming reality for you. That everything reconnects back to it. That's the lens that you're often pulled to see your world through. And there's a danger that we can see sex as a problem or a preoccupation, but Paul is giving us a picture here that neither of those should be true. That sex instead should be a priority to pursue. So how do we make it a priority? What does that look like? Well, I wish I had a silver bullet for you here this morning, but I don't. But I know what the Bible teaches, that we should love our neighbor as ourselves. And one of the ways that we love our spouse as ourselves is by making sex a priority in our marriage, by finding ways to prioritize it in the midst of all of the other pulls that life is making on our time and demand. And so for you men, why is it, and I'm speaking to myself in this same capacity, why is it that we will give more energy and strategy to closing a business deal than we will to how we're going to romance our wives? And we wonder why it is that we can't close the deal in the bedroom when we're not putting that energy into the home in the same way that we're doing it in our businesses. And for the ladies, why is it that in some cases you may be more likely to say yes to the desires of your children when they come and ask you for good things than you are to your husband when he asks you for this? Why is that? Is that revealing a way that we are not seeing sex as a priority as Paul intended it? See, Paul starts here in verses 1 and 2 by speaking in the way that sex is a priority, but I want you to notice next about how he talks in verses 3 and 4 about the way that sex is a gift. So look back at the text there. Here's what he says. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. And so we live in a culture where the underlying principle when it comes to sexuality is that sex is a right. It's something that you deserve. And so as a result of that, you should be able to have whatever you want, with whoever you want, whenever you want. But Paul here treats sex not as a right, but as a gift. So you see there in verse 3, he says, the husband should give to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. Paul is painting this picture that God has designed sex as a gift to be enjoyed. And we see several reasons why that is the case. 5 aspects of the good gift of sex right here in 1 Corinthians, in the book of 1 Corinthians. The first one is that we recognize from 1 Corinthians that sex is a gift from God. And so if we were to look back at verse 19 of chapter 6 that Andrew preached on last week, Paul says to the Corinthians and to us, you are not your own. As he begins this conversation about sexuality, he reminds us whose we are. And God has wired all of us for intimacy, but he's wired oftentimes men and women in different ways. And so you've probably heard in the past that when it comes to sex, men are like microwaves, women are like crockpot. You ever heard that terminology before? I want to give you a different categorization. I want to tell you that men are like Pie 5 pizza and women are like Chipotle burritos. And here's what I mean. So if you've ever been to Pie 5 pizza, when you go to there, it's similar to Chipotle. You go in and you get the pizza, you tell them what ingredients you want, but in order to take that pizza and take it from making the ingredients to the finished product, they've got to send it through the oven. There's no oven involved at Chipotle. There's the oven there at Pie 5, and the secret of this oven is it's always on. It's always running. It's always ready to go. And it's got this little conveyor belt that's always pulling things towards it to want to run it through to completion. And it doesn't matter what's put on there. It could be a pepperoni pizza, a supreme pizza, a barbecue chicken pizza. It could be a piece of paper. It doesn't matter. It's ready. The fire is always running. The oven is always on. See, a microwave, you got to actually press buttons to get that thing operational. That's not the way that men work. God has wired us for intimacy like Pie 5 pizza. But a woman, on the other hand, is like a Chipotle burrito. So you wait in that long line and you get up to the front and they ask you what you want. And you start telling them, I want this ingredient and that. I don't want any of that. Add some of this sauce. And there's a whole process. And they make that burrito. You watch it growing. It's building over time right there in front of your eyes. And then at the end, what do? They wrap it up in that tin foil. And for you men, you got to understand about the women, unless you let them go through the whole process and unless all the right ingredients are present, you don't get to unwrap the foil. That's the way that it works. See, God has designed sex as a good gift for each one of us, and he's wired men and women differently. And so the question we need to be confronted with this morning is, do we believe that God knows what's best for our sexuality? Do you genuinely believe that? Because if this is a gift of God for us to enjoy, then what that means is we dishonor the giver of that gift whenever we use it in the wrong way, or at the wrong time, or for the wrong person, or for the wrong purpose, or with the wrong person. See, Paul lays out to them the way that sex is a gift from God. But notice, second, he talks about the way that sex is a gift of sacrificial service. So if you look back in verse 3, he talks about the way that the husband should give to his wife. Paul is speaking here of the way that when it comes to sex, sex is more about what you can give than what you can get. And that's totally different than the picture that we see in our culture, where the culture is all about what you can get. When Cami and I went on vacation last week, we went down to Mexico, and I think we were about the only non-college spring break people that were on there. In fact, we were sitting on the airplane, and they served the drinks on the plane, and a few rows behind us, we start hearing this hooping and hollering, and we turn around, and what do we see? We see one of these guys had brought his beer funnel on the plane, and had gotten his 12-ounce can of beer, and his friend was helping him to chug his beer on the airplane while the flight attendant was filming the video of the action. That was the kind of environment we were on in that airplane and around us while we were down in Mexico. And in that situation, the culture is telling us and feeding to us daily, sex is all about what you can get. Every one of those guys or girls were probably going down there with one thing on their mind, hoping to find satisfaction sexually. But what Paul gives here is a countercultural message, and it's countercultural in two ways. The first one I've already said, sex is more about what you can give than what you can get. But the other issue that's here that might pass right over you if we don't focus on it is the shocking nature of the reciprocal nature of sexuality that Paul talks about here. Because what does he say? He doesn't just say that the wife should give herself to the husband. No, he says that the husband should give his conjugal rights to the wife. And in that culture, women had few rights, if any. And it would have been surprising, even shocking for the men in that culture to give up anything to the women in that culture. And yet, Paul says there's this mutuality in marriage, that there's a giving from one to another that should be there. There needs to be that disposition when it comes to marital intimacy for Christians. And that kind of thing should transform your date night. So when you're out at J. Alexander's and you might be eating some rattlesnake pasta and you're having a good conversation with your spouse, catching up without the kids around, and there's an element of conversational intimacy that's there that you're hoping will ultimately lead to a physical intimacy that's later on. If you come into that date night saying, my priority tonight is not what am I going to get out of this, but what am I going to give, that will change the experience that you have. And it will help to foster a better enjoyment of this good gift that God's given us. But notice third here, also in verse 3, Paul talks about how sex is a gift for pleasure. He speaks there not just about the husband giving to the wife, but also likewise the wife giving to the husband. You know, if you think about it, God could have designed the process of reproduction in any number of ways. And yet He decided to create the pathway to reproducing the next generation through something that's not just for the sake of offspring, but also for the sake of pleasure. That there is an enjoyment to the sexual activity that leads to children. He could have created a pathway to reproduction without enjoyment. And yet God intended from the very beginning that sex was designed for pleasure. But let's be honest with each other this morning. Living in a fallen world, what is often intended for pleasure by God is often experienced as pain by many of us, even in this room. Many of us know the pain of sexual brokenness. Whether that's a long history of pornography that you've hidden from many people. Whether that's sexual abuse that you've experienced that you've never talked about. Whether that's a string of boyfriends or girlfriends in your past that you slept with that you're humiliated by looking back. You're ashamed of what you've done. We know that sense of pain that can come acutely with sexuality. And you know why the pain hurts that bad? Because there's a reality in our spiritual lives that what God intended for the greatest pleasure, Satan can use to inflict the greatest pain. And this is one of those arenas where there can be great pleasure and great pain. See, God designed the sexual appetite, but sin corrupted it in a way where we are faced with choices every day. Are we going to pursue a path that dishonors God, that leads to sexual pain? Or are we going to pursue a path that honors God, that leads to pleasure? See, Paul grants this picture here that sex is a gift for our pleasure, but he also tells us as a fourth idea about sex as a gift, that sex is a gift within God's design. Do you see what he says in verse 4? For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Paul speaks there of authority. When he talks about authority, he's talking about God's design for sex, what he intends. And he's saying, yes, you have responsibility and authority over your own body, but when you enter the marriage union, when you say I do, you are giving up that authority to someone else. And God's design for sexuality is that in intimacy, we give over our bodies to the other person. So just as we've been bought with a price by Christ, we are now, our bodies are the responsibility and authority of someone else. And what I do with my body has everything to do with my wife. And what she does with her body has everything to do with me. There's a mutuality that's there with God's design. But in the midst of that, the brokenness that we just talked about often happens when that authority is violated. And that can show up in a number of ways. That can show up with the issue of pornography. So if we're just talking about porn, if we're being real honest, both in the culture and right here in the seats of this church, it is a cancer that is ravaging many of us, both men and women. And the reason I call it a cancer, because you know people that have had cancer before. And in the early stages of cancer, from the outside it appears like everything's fine. Nothing's changed about them. They're just their normal old self. But on the inside, where no one else can see it, their body is being ravaged and destroyed and hollowed out on a physical level. And the same is true when it comes to the issue of pornography. That you might be able to keep up a front to everybody else that everything's fine, that things are good. And yet on the inside, you know the hollowness that's there. You know the shame that it brings. You know the despair and the humiliation that you have. See, pornography is like buying a Christmas gift for someone else and then keeping it for yourself. You know, you see something you think they're really going to like, and you buy it for them with the good intention of giving it to them at the proper time. But then the more you look at it, you say, you know what? I'd like to have this. This would be great for me to keep for myself, for my own pleasure. And so instead of taking what was intended to serve someone else for their good, you turn inward on yourself and you use that gift to satisfy your own desires. Pornography is one of the ways that we can short-circuit God's design for marriage and for sexuality. But that also shows up not just with pornography, but with abuse. So there are men and women in this room and around us that have experienced the difficulties of being abused sexually or sexually assaulted or other things like that. And what's happening in that moment? What's happening is someone is taking authority over your body in a way that God has not granted them the rights to do it. Paul speaks here about a rightful sharing of authority, of a husband and a wife giving themselves over to each other. And when that assault or abuse occurs, it ruptures God's design because it is someone taking authority over someone else's body in a way that God has not intended. But this violation of God's design also shows up in various categories of sexual immorality, whether that's premarital sex, or same-sex sexual activity, whether it's adultery, all of these other ways that are disruptive of God's design for sexuality. But here's what we need to remember. There is nothing that has happened to you in your past. There is nothing that you have done or that someone else has done to you that Christ cannot set you free from. One of the lies that Satan will feed you is that what you have done when it comes to sex is so bad and so dark and so deep that you can't be set free. But that is the gift of the gospel. It doesn't matter what we have done. We can find deliverance in Christ. He says there is a good design for us to follow in God's gift of sex. But notice with me another aspect of this gift. Paul speaks of the way that sex is a gift for God's glory. We already talked about this. The last verse before the passage that we read in 1 Corinthians 6:20, Paul commands the church to glorify God in their bodies. And it's kind of a strange question to ask yourself. How do I glorify God through my sex? I know how to glorify God through my parenting, through my work, through my evangelism, through my service to the community. What does it look like to glorify God through sex? It means that the centerpiece of our activity, whether it's in our thought life or in our intimate actions, shouldn't be turned inward on satisfying our own desires, but instead should be given with a view towards pleasing God and honoring Him and living out this good design and living for His glory. See, Paul speaks here of the way that sex is a gift, but I want you to notice with me last in verse 5, the way that Paul speaks of sex, the way that sex is a weapon. Do you see this in verse 5? Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer. But then come together again so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. See, Paul warns us of the way that sex can be used as a weapon, both for good and for evil. And we see sex used as a weapon all the time in our culture. We see it in advertisements that leverage sexuality to entice our appetites in order to buy things that we may or may not want. We've already talked about the way that sex is used as a weapon in sexual assault or abuse or harassment. In the way the culture seeks to harness sex and to use it as a weapon is to take what God designed to be good and to lead people to use it in ways that are rupturing that design. But outside of the way that the culture uses sex as a weapon, Paul gives us a picture here of 4 different ways that sex is often a weapon in our own lives. And I want you to notice all of those here. He says first in verse 5 that sex is often a weapon in our relationships. Do you see what he says there? He says, do not deprive one another. That's the phrase that he uses. And what he is getting there at its root is that oftentimes sex is used as a weapon between a man and a woman, whether in a dating relationship or in marriage or in whatever relationship they may be in. But Paul says here that the natural disposition in the home should be that we do not deprive one another of sex. That sex should be part of the normal rhythm of the home. Instead, what often happens is sex is turned into a weapon for evil purposes, which can often lead to scars and brokenness. So maybe that shows up in some situation where sex is used to manipulate. So you think of the high school girlfriend who's worried about her boyfriend leaving her, and so she entices him and she pleases him sexually in order to keep him from breaking up with her. She uses that to manipulate his feelings towards her in order to maintain the relationship that she doesn't want to lose. Maybe you see sex as a weapon when a spouse withholds sex from their wife or their husband, where the spouse feels powerless in other areas, and so their only way to exert some control in the relationship is to withhold sex and to limit that experience for the other. They use it as a weapon to push back against the control that's exerted against them in other areas of their life. You might see sex used as a weapon in relationships through pressure. Whether that's the college guy who's pressuring a girl to do things that she doesn't really want to do, or the husband or the wife that's pressuring towards sexual frequency or sexual activity that the other is not comfortable with. These are some of the ways that sex is used as a weapon for evil. But instead, sex can often be used as a weapon for great good. And so you think about just the way that God has hardwired each one of us for sexual desire and our sexual drive, and the way that after sexual intimacy is completed, there's a sense of satisfaction of your sex drive where it seems like, man, I'm good for a while. But then whether it's days later or weeks later, or for some of you men, a few hours later, that desire returns. And that is part of God's good design. It's a weapon to draw us back towards intimacy with our spouse and to have that encounter. And so there are many ways that sex can be used as a weapon, both for good and for ill in our relationships. But you'll also notice here the way that Paul speaks of how sex is a weapon in our spiritual lives. Do you see what he says there? Verse 5, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer. So Paul draws this connection between our sexual lives and our spiritual lives. You know, we just finished our 30 days of prayer emphasis. Now we've been in 2 weeks of talking about sex. Maybe we need to have a new 30-day emphasis over the next few weeks and see what comes from that. You know, Jed often talked about in the prayer series, specificity leads to visibility. I'm just saying. Huh? But as I was preparing the sermon this week, you know what I got to thinking about? Is I wonder how many of you that are in married relationships in this whole 30 days of prayer had something related to sexuality on your prayer list. God, would you transform our sexual relationship with one another? Would you help us move towards deeper intimacy? Would you help us to have greater desire or greater frequency? Would you help us to get past the roadblocks that we're having? And for those of you that aren't married, maybe you're single or single again, or you are just coming of age and you are faced with sexual temptation all of the time. You long to be married. You have exactly what Paul speaks of later on here, a burning with passion. And is that a regular part of your prayer life? That you are seeking deliverance from the temptation that God has brought into your life. See, Paul writes here of a connection between our sexual lives and our spiritual life. In this case, he's saying the basic premise of marital sexuality should be we don't deprive each other. We have a disposition and a tendency towards sexual encounter in marriage, but there may be seasons, there may be times where we need to withdraw for a limited time for concentrated seasons of prayer and devotion to the Lord. And what he is highlighting there is in the same way that the Bible gives a picture of fasting, where we turn away from the good gift of food so that we might bring ourselves closer to God. He speaks in a similar way of a sense of sexual fast, where we turn away from the good gift of sexuality in order to experience and to pursue God. See, he makes this connection between sexuality and spirituality in a way that reminds us sex can be a weapon that shapes our spiritual lives. But notice what he does here at the end of verse 5. He speaks third of the way that sex is often a weapon in Satan's attack. You see what he says at the end? So that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Now, if you're anything like me, it's March Madness season and we're getting down to the Final Four and my bracket's busted. I've got like one path to possibly win my office bracket, and it has to have like 500 impossible things that are almost certainly not going to happen. It's because you always have upsets in March Madness, and that's one of the exciting things about it, is you have team versus team that normally don't play each other, and they have a short window of time to prepare, but each one of those coaching staffs right now, as we are here this morning, are developing a game plan to defeat their enemy. They're looking for tendencies. They're looking for gaps and weaknesses. They're looking for opportunities to exploit that enemy and to defeat them on the court. And what we have to realize, what Paul is saying here in verse 5, is that Satan too is seeking to develop a customized game plan to destroy each one of our lives. And that one of the primary arenas that he seeks to bring destruction is through our sexuality. He says, you need to come back together again so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. See, when it comes to sex, Satan works in two primary ways. First, Satan works through temptation. He takes the good sexual appetite that God has given us, and he appeals to that appetite for us to satisfy it through forbidden fruit. And he leads us into sexual sin. And then what does he do? He comes behind that deception and he follows it up with accusation. I can't believe you did that. You claim to be a solid Christian, and yet you're looking at women like that? Man, if anybody knew what you were doing behind closed doors when you think nobody see it, you would lose all credibility in your community. You would lose all intimacy with your spouse. That accusation follows in there after that temptation. And what we have to recognize is that when it comes to sex, our primary goal is not sexual satisfaction for those of you that are in marriage, or it's not saving yourself for marriage if you are not yet married. The goal is holiness. It's becoming more like Jesus. And if we are doing that, that's going to lead to sexual satisfaction in marriage. And if we do that, that's going to lead to saving yourself when it comes to those of you that are single. See, sex is often a weapon in Satan's attack, which means, last, that we need to recognize, fourth, that sex is often a weapon in our spiritual victory. He says in verse 5, then come together again. There's a picture of a reuniting between husband and wife, a reconciliation, a restoration of intimacy that occurs. The picture there when he says come together is it's a fleshing out of this idea that a man and a woman are, the two become one and become one flesh. And as that restoration of sexual intimacy is restored, the Bible throughout its whole sweep is showing us a connection between the marriage between a man and a woman and the way that is intended to picture the relationship between Christ and the church. That just as a man and woman come together in intimacy, that Christ and his bride come together as one through the shed blood of Jesus. See, the Bible is clear that all of us are sinners. We've all been separated from God. We have fallen short of his design, often in ways that relate to sexuality. And we need that reconciliation. We need that redemption. And that's why we turn to Jesus, the one who took on flesh and lived a life of no sin, who resisted all temptation, including the temptation towards sexual sin. He died and rose again on our behalf, and he speaks to his bride, calling each one of us to faith, calling us to this reconciliation, calling us to this intimacy with him. I never expected my 6-year-old son to sit there when I got back from Mexico and say, Dad, do you have sex with Mom? And after I told him, yes, son, I do. And that's where your brothers and you came from. I said, now, I told you your friend, his understanding of sex wasn't right. And if he starts talking about that again, you don't pay him any attention because he doesn't know what he's talking about. But I said to him, do you want to learn about what sex is? And he said, yes. And I said, okay, well, do you want to learn about that now? Or do you want to learn about that later? And he thought about it for a little while. And he pondered it. And he said, how about next Tuesday after dinner? So I've at least bought myself a few more days before we have to have that conversation. But it reminded me of the fact that this issue is an urgent issue in our culture and our families. We can't run from it. We can't hide from it. We need to be honest with it. And if we are going to understand this rightly, we need to start having the kinds of conversations we need to have with our spouse, with our children, with brothers and sisters in this church, so that we might pursue sexuality in the way that Paul speaks of it here, recognizing that sex is a priority, sex is a gift, and that sex is a weapon to be used for God's glory. Let's close in prayer together.